Yeah.
Nobody can. They want to cook or come to Sunday school.
Right, I know. Well, we were going to, we came in yesterday, we were going to set it up at that end because we knew there might be noise that was leaving from the kitchen, bringing stuff down, but somebody had already set the stuff up for us, so we were appreciative of it.
We were grateful.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't look back at the
Am
camera.
I in the way of the camera?
Your own live.
Okay,
You're fine.
Right.
Your hair shows well.
okay.
Good luck.
I just didn't start it.
I wasn't looking here.
Good morning, everybody.
You had something else?
He would.
He didn't. You said that you have announced. Thanks for
Your husband.
No, I don't have any.
How are you? Okay. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Good.
Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to wrap up the 3-week series that's been done on the 4 denominations that have been instrumental in starting the United Church. I think the last 2 weeks you covered the disciples and the Presbyterians, and today we're going to concentrate primarily on the Methodists, but we'll also touch on, at least briefly, the United Church of Christ. Well, let's see how it goes on the noise because they're bringing down food and stuff.
Right. Talking to my teachers.
Yeah, it totally was all the teachers.
Yes, it was all the teachers in there.
That is the break room for you guys.
How many people here are Methodists, or former Methodists? Okay, now that's not surprising because Methodists are the largest represented denomination here at the United Church, and it's the second largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. Anybody want to guess what the largest Protestant denomination is? Southern Baptist, correct. Yeah, Southern Baptist is the largest. The Methodist is a interesting, in fact, unique product of the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, which came after the Reformation. Oh, sorry. And also the American experience, and that's kind of the order we're going to be taking things in today. So, first question: who's the founder of Methodism?
John Wesley.
John Wesley. And what denomination was he?
Presbyterian? No, he's a Church of England.
I don't know.
Tracy's got it.
Church of England.
Church of England. Yeah, in fact, he never was a Methodist. Even though the Methodist denomination started, prior to his death, he remained a lifelong Anglican. How about the term Methodism? Where does it come from?
The way they did their business.
Methodical.
They have a method.
But a little more from it. It actually goes back to when he was in college at Oxford. There was a group of them that get together called the Holiness Club, and the other students would poke fun at them because of they were so methodical in the things they did, and they started calling them Methodists. But then they decided that wasn't a bad term, and so they took it on, and it kind of stuck throughout his life, of course, up till now. Was Wesley ever in America?
Did you say
Did he ever come to America?
He visited once or twice.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, one time. Yeah, after he graduated and was ordained as an Anglican priest, he came over as a missionary to Georgia for a couple of years, but it really wasn't a very good experience. He was having a crisis of faith at the time, and was not successful at all in his mission. But during the course of the trip, he met a group of pietists from Moravia, which is eastern Czechoslovakia today. And he was really impressed with their faith and their confidence. And as he described in his later writings in his diary, at this time he was an almost Christian, but he was impressed by these people he felt like were fully Christian. So when he got back, he went over to Moravia, met with the leaders there, spent some time with them, and then when he returned to London, he was at a Moravian weekly Bible study, and he had, what he wrote in his diary was a warming, strange warming of the heart. And that was a British understatement, you know, because that really kick-started Wesley, and he took off after that and never really slowed down. He would preach initially out of the pulpit his ideas of how he felt that the Church of England should be reformed, particularly with regard to social issues. But he was started to be viewed as kind of radical for them, so he was shut out of the preaching in the churches, but he was then moved to the fields, and he would draw sometimes hundreds and thousands of people to his preaching. And one of the things he emphasized throughout his preaching was that there needed to be improvements there in England and through the Church of England to be more socially conscious and try to help people. And there's a lot of things he did, such as he started the first free medical clinic in London. He started a lending society where they would lend money to poor people at 0% interest. Created a work relief program, job program for people who are unemployed. Started a women's co-op for making clothes, and sent missionaries to America. But that all came to a screeching halt with the Revolutionary War. And so at the end of the war, there was a split between the church, you know, in terms of those in England and those in America, and he recognized it wasn't going to be coming back together anytime soon. So he supported the formation of what became the Methodist Episcopal Church right after the war in 1784 in Boston, what they call a Christmas conference. In fact, it was on Christmas Eve that the Methodist Church was officially founded. But throughout, like I said, throughout his life, he lived a number of years after that. He never became a Methodist, and the Church of England, you know, kept him as a member of the Anglican Church throughout that. Okay, now with regard to his views on modernity, or you know, through the period of Enlightenment, he was very interested in science and philosophy and logic, which were keynotes of as that separated from being under the church's control for centuries to be independent disciplines. And in fact, he did a number of experiments on electricity and magnetism. He even corresponded with Benjamin Franklin concerning experiments that he did. But of course, he was first and foremost focused on trying to reform and improve things in the church, particularly with regard to the social ministry for the church. Wesley was always what we call acreedal. He didn't have anything particularly strong feelings with regard to creeds. He said if they help people, that's fine. In fact, what he said was, as to all opinions which do not strike at the heart of Christianity, we think and let think. And that stayed with him throughout his life. In terms of trying to come to religious knowledge and how to improve your faith, people typically identify the Wesley quadrilateral. And some of you all probably heard that term. And these were 4 different ways that he felt that it is important for people to utilize in terms of trying to improve their faith and retain a proper balance between them. So what were the 4 elements of the cooperative dialogue?
Scripture.
First of all, Scripture.
Reason.
First of all, the Bible. Pardon?
Reason?
Reason, yes, yeah. Said if you couldn't believe it in your heart, it's going to be hard to pick up a true faith. It's to tradition. Said it's important to understand the church tradition and how things evolved and respected. And then fourthly, and this is a key thing that he added that the Anglicans had not focused on, but he was impressed with pietists, and that was experience, personal experience. He felt you needed a combination of all of these to be a proper Christian. With respect to specifics about his beliefs, I think it's interesting to compare and contrast Wesley's teachings to the Calvinistic Reform movement. And this board, which is left from previous class, I see that y'all talked about tulip. And for those y'all that were here, can anyone tell us what tulip was or is?
Andy knows.
No, I mean beyond the. Okay, in the early years of the Reform movement that Calvin was instrumental in getting started, there was a meeting of the like-minded people they called the Synod of Dort, and they came up with a stated list of their beliefs to identify what I was meant by the Reform movement. And it was this, the acronym TULIP was used to indicate that first they believed in total depravity. What they mean by that was they believed in original sin, and that all people going back to Adam and Eve, actions were imputed with guilt that justifiably would send us all to perdition and to the devil. Secondly, was unconditional election. By that he meant that even though we're all justified in God sending us all to hell, that God, and only through God's action, we're not all destined, to end up that way. The third, limited atonement, meant that while God's action would, particularly through Christ, death and resurrection was instrumental and the key thing that allowed people to be saved. It didn't apply to all people. There was a limited atonement. Some were predestined to be saved, and some to be damned. Irresistible grace. If you're one of those that were to be saved, you could run, but you couldn't hide. Eventually, God was going to get you on the right path. And the last one, perseverance of the saints, meant that once you were saved, you were always saved. It's a one-time event. If it turned out you were saved and then backslid, well, it just simply meant you weren't saved to begin with in the first place. Okay? So this is what the Reformed followers of Calvin came up with as a shorthand way to summarize what their beliefs were. Now, back to the Methodists. What's interesting is to see how John Wesley viewed each of those points. First of all, with regard to total depravity, that we're all have an inherent guilt that we can't avoid, he said, no, that's not true. He did not believe in inherent guilt. with regard to unconditional election. He said, yes, certainly we are saved because of God's actions on our behalf, because of Christ's actions. But our faith also contributes to our being saved. We have to be a participant. So he disagreed with that. How about limited atonement? What do you think his view of that was? That some are just to be saved and some not?
I don't think he liked that.
No, he didn't like that either. How about irresistible grace? Those that are saved, your God's going to get you, and then that's his intention, and he's going to drive you, toward salvation. What do you think he thought on that?
It's good.
I'm not
I
sure.
would think you thought everybody had it, not just chosen ones.
He felt that everybody had the potential for
Yeah.
being saved. That we call it prevenient grace. That is in all of us. But in terms of being irresistible, no. He said that we are free to resist it. That we have to participate and work with God on our salvation. So he disagreed on that as well. Well, how about the last one? Perseverance. Always saved, always saved. Do you think he agreed on that?
Probably not.
No, I don't think he agreed with that either.
There's a tree
No,
here.
he said, even if you're truly saved, by your actions and what you do, you can't backslide. He said salvation is a lifetime activity. It's not once and for all. So there was honestly a clear distinction, and debates that were very lively during the 18th century with Wesley and those of the from the Calvinistic background. And I think if you want to look at a brief summary in my mind, when you look at the Reformed approach, their emphasis is really on God's sovereignty. God is in charge. Wesley didn't disagree with that, but he puts a lot of emphasis on God's love and the fact that everybody has a potential for being saved and have to be active participants in that activity. Okay, let's turn to Methodism in America. At the end of the Revolutionary War, the Congregationalists were the largest denomination in America. Second was Presbyterians. But over the next 50 years, it changed quite a bit. And so that by the time the Civil War comes around, Methodism is now the #1 denomination, and Baptists are the second largest of the denominations. In fact, from 1820 to 1920, Methodism was the largest denomination in America. Want to guess what the second largest was?
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian?
Baptist.
Catholics.
Oh, there you go.
And it was only after in the 1920s with the immigrations that were coming over from Europe that the Catholics surpassed the Methodists. Methodists stayed the largest Protestant denomination up until about 1960, and that's when the Baptists, the Southern Baptists, passed it. In terms of organization, what Wesley identified was in recommendations to the church that was founded here in America, was set in Baltimore in 1784. It was following the Anglican form, which was Episcopal, which meant that the bishops are in charge of the day-to-day activities. They're the ones that ordain the ministers, or the ones that select the ministers who will go to specific churches, as opposed to congregational approach, which is where ministers are called and very commonly and often ordained by the congregation or their next level up of collections and congregations. In terms of sacraments, the Methodists, following Wesley's tradition, have open communion to everyone, and they believe and support the infant baptism. They continue with the social ministries throughout, particularly the 18th century, again, going back to Wesley and continuing in America with anti-slavery movements, with women's rights movements, with temperance movements. And there's some organizations that have spun off from Methodists, such as, such as the Salvation Army and the Goodwill Industries, came out of the Methodist activities. But primarily, in terms of spin-offs, it's the other denominations. There's over 60 denominations worldwide that have spun off from Methodism, including some like the Church of God, Nazarenes, Assemblies of God, Foursquare Gospel, a lot of Pentecostal groups, again with that emphasis on experience. And today, the Methodists are the fourth largest denomination worldwide. The Pentecostals, when you take them as a collective group, are number one. Baptists, number two. Lutherans, third, and then the Methodists. But it turns out that now, in America, less than 10% of the Methodists are in America. That the worldwide missions and activities of the Methodism over the 19th and 20th centuries have really grown the worldwide church. And that sort of, curiously enough, has led to the situation right now that some of you all are probably aware of, is that the Methodists are splitting again. The Methodists, by the way, going back to when the first few years after they first began, started splitting in several groups, and then they've come back and split again. As of the 1st of May, there was a group called the Global Methodist Church that is formed from the conservative side of the Methodists. Again, it's dominated very strongly by those countries outside of the U.S., including Philippines and African countries, that have decided they don't like the direction, the way things are going with the United Methodist Church and being too liberal. And so they're now have declared separation. And they're starting the process that's going to take several years for this division to occur. I guess if we're okay on time, I'll give you a little bit more background in case you're interested in it. The key event, or I'm sorry, the key issue that's causing the separation is same-sex marriage and LGBT ordinations. Same thing that's affected the other Protestant denominations. And the Methodists have been the ones that have been really holding the line because of the central control through this Episcopal organization in terms of declaring both of those are sins and not approved and supported by the church. But for the last 50 years, every time they've had a meeting of the what they call a general conference, it meets every 4 years to confirm bishops, new bishops, and to make any changes to the bylaws, if you will. They call it the discipline. This issue's come up and been debated. And finally, in the 2016 general conference, that they decided, okay, we're not getting anywhere. We're continuing to argue this same point. We'll call a special general conference. I think it's the first time it's ever happened. And it would be only address this one issue about same-sex marriage and gay ordinations. And so it met January 2019, and they worked very hard trying to come up with what was the proper solution. And they finally decided the best solution is to split. And they were going, and it was going to be voted on at the next general conference, which was scheduled for 2020. COVID. But what happened in 2020?
The Chinese unleashed a bioweapon.
So it turned out it got postponed. They said, okay, we'll postpone this vote until 2022, August 2022, starting tomorrow, or this next month, would be a rescheduled conference that they'll put this to a vote. But earlier this year, seeing how the pandemic problems were continuing, they decided, well, we better postpone it again to 2024. In the meantime, in the U.S. in particular, a number of ministers had come out, declaring that they were openly gay and they were performing same-sex marriages. And the rest of the more conservative side of the church said, this is the third time we're putting this off, and and you're continuing to ignore what's written in this our agreed upon ways of operating. So we're just going to split, and that's what this one May split is that started.
What's the name of the split group?
The Global Methodist Church.
GMC.
And there's also the United Methodist Church, which is what they're splitting from. So if you want to put simplistic terms on it, the Global's the more conservative, the United is going to end up, because of their leaving, churches leaving, the more liberal. And it's also interesting that the U.S., which is, of course, historically dominated the Methodist Church organization and policies for a couple centuries, will not have entire subgroups go over. They call it annual conferences, but individual churches can switch, and so that's what they're trying to work down. Outside the U.S., whole conferences can go over, and some of them already have, like Romania and Bulgaria, I think, have already shifted, totally over to the more conservative global one.
Which way is the U.S.
What
conferences?
U.S. is split, it's a lot of things. We're split between the conservatives and the liberals. But with this removal of the U.S. Individual churches deciding to go over, and a lot of churches have started going over to global, that by definition, the United Methodist Church is going to end up being more liberal, and the global.
You have to look at the sign when you're walking
It won't.
into a church.
So how are the individual churches going to decide? Do you have any idea? That's still being worked out.
Yeah, that's to
The
be.
individual church,
Yeah.
how the congregation is going to decide what to do and what role the bishop plays in this.
Well, they've already said that the bishops, which oversee these annual conferences, they will not go over in mass. That's sort of written in the law.
So
They'll
split too.
But individual churches within those, yes, can split.
So kind of like the Presbyterians have
So
done.
basically, it's a mess.
Yeah.
It's been a mess for several years.
Kind of like the Presbyterians have done, right?
All of the other mainline churches
Yeah.
have split. And either congregationally, individuals going over, or more centrally organized groups like the Presbyterians have
Our
had
hometown,
splits in the
our
past.
hometown, I guess, has the largest Presbyterian church went the conservative way, but there's others that are the other, I'm not forget the name, but anyway.
Do you mind if I interject on this?
Sure.
I've been very curious and obviously following this very intently. So when this vote happened in 2016, or this idea, most U.S. Methodist churches, about 70% or higher, were in favor of same-sex marriage or ordaining gay and lesbian clergy. But they had taken the same approach that the Presbyterians took, where we are going to allow this as a whole, but we're going to allow it for each individual church. So each individual church will have its own autonomy. We don't want to split. So what happened, though, and if y'all know this already, we can discuss it later, but really what happened was the African churches that are a little bit more on the conservative side that pushed for this decision to come to the floor. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's why it might not feel like the American church as a whole reflects this Methodist opinion, and it's because it doesn't. It really reflects Methodist worldwide. And where it's going to get gross is actually, when it all comes down to it, it comes down to money, unfortunately. And what I mean by that is, the people that want to leave the United Methodist Church, they don't own their building. It is not theirs. And so it's the same problem with Presbyterians. And so that's where it's gonna get a little bit messy, because they have to figure it out from a financial standpoint. And it's also possible that a bishop or his governing body, they could decide as a whole that they want their entire area to leave.
No, not in the US.
No, not in the U.S., but it's also not within their power. It comes down to an individual church, so they can't make this unilateral decision for all the churches. It's kind of gross here, and it's going to get nasty and contentious. And I'm sorry.
It already has.
It already has, and I'm sorry. You know, the reason I've been so curious is, you know, what will happen, because it's one of our founding denominations here, and the best answer I can give you is no one knows. We're in a very unique situation here. Not many Methodist churches are in affiliation with 3 other denominations.
Larry, this happened in the Episcopal Church, as you know, about 15, 17 years ago. And same thing, you know, it was, they moved into shopping centers, and they're still doing it, and started an Anglican church that originated in Africa. And it was hard. It was really hard. A lot of friends of mine did that. And I helped a lot of them because, you know, I mean, everybody's entitled to their own opinion about what it should be. So, yeah, it was really messy, and it lasted, you know, 7 or 8 years struggling. But now it's pretty settled. We still have churches in shopping centers, but they're still old. They'll build their own building.
Well, and somebody in here said, you know, you got to look at the sign, and I think you just have to ask yourself, you know, is this really going to affect my relationship with God?
No.
You know, if my church splits over this, is it going to affect my relationship? And for some of us, the answer is yes, and for most of us, the answer is no.
But this has been brewing for a long
Oh,
time.
yeah.
It is just time.
Yeah, and it
It
wouldn't
is
have happened
just-
if the Methodists had the majority within the United States. But this is, you know, it's the same with Catholics as a whole. There's a lot more conservative Catholics in South America, you know, that drive a lot of the votes that happen within the papacy.
Well, and also, you know, it depends on the church. Like the little church I was in Brenham, it's a very conservative Episcopal church. I mean, they would never hire someone who was gay to be their minister. It's just openly gay to be their minister because they're too conservative. So I never left the Episcopal church because it was conservative.
No, and I really would love that if the Methodist Church as a whole just said, you know, we're going to leave it up to each individual church to have its own autonomy and decide how they want to move
Doesn't it
forward.
look that
But
way
the
though?
problem
Yeah.
with that is with the Methodists is the whole structure of Methodist is this Episcopal structure.
Oh yeah, I hear you.
And,
Trust me.
and so it basically has to move to a Presbyterian or congregational structure for that to happen.
Yeah, and I'm not asking that they become Presbyterian.
No. I'm
Heaven
not saying,
forbid.
I'm just saying, in terms of the political policy, the polity of the church, that it's the very nature of the Methodist
Yeah.
Church is it's held on so long to this conservative position. And so when the split comes, it's not just little pieces coming off here and there. It's a bigger split.
Could this affect the entire structure of Methodist churches with the bishops and annual conferences and all that?
State
Not
law.
here.
It
Yeah,
could.
it's,
It
I-
could.
you know, it's gonna have, obviously have impact,
Yeah.
but how it's gonna exactly shape out.
I know if I would guess on that, Harry, I would say that what's going to happen is you're going to have United Methodist, and they're going to keep the same structure in place that has been in place for hundreds of years. With these offshoots, these branches, if they can find a way to financially leave their governing body, they're going to become more like a Baptist church. They
Sure.
work autonomously, but hopefully have a system of government that is similar to what they have now. But they're trying to move. They don't really know where they're going to move. It's like, are these people going to have new elected leaders that are, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
It's like the guy who calls himself the Pope in Spain. You ever heard of that guy? What a wacko.
Yeah, I heard Dan Ballard's book.
In the middle of all this, and we just been talking about the denomination and the churches, is the pastors. And some could be very strong one way or another and be sent into the congregation and said, well, I don't care, or I want to go this way. Because of that, and knowing that we'll be looking for a pastor, I've made some contacts through several sources to let us know, you know, if there will be people who will be going more on a call basis or something, they got caught where they're looking for a church.
Yeah, in the past here at the United Church, we've not really been able to tap into the
Yeah,
Methodists
because
of their structure and.
They use a call system, and if you look at what we've been getting for pastors, we get PhD level. So we're not looking for their lowest level. We want more of their better ones. And so if you're a bishop handling people out, so why would I send my best guy or gal to Angel Fire, which is sort of out of my control? And so if they were going to give us somebody, it wouldn't necessarily be their best.
But now with this split going on in the Methodist Church, perhaps there'd be more opportunity for.
And the challenge for us then, looking at our bylaws, is do we interpret United Methodist as what it was before, and we put a slash in and say United Methodist / global, we'll talk to everybody. But then that forces us then, how do we get in relationship, and we'd have to talk to the global people. But we're in the middle of it too, if you like it or not. It's at some level because of our relationship.
Where do the Free Methodists fit in?
The Free Methodists. I'm not sure. I'm just going to guess that you're going to see them on the conservative.
Oh, yeah.
They
are the conservative side.
And Wesley.
But I don't know specifically with regard to what their discussions are going on with the global Methodist Church.
It has no effect on them.
I don't know.
So they're Methodist in name only. So like there's evangelical Presbyterians. You ever heard of that denomination? The answer is no, you haven't. But they're like Free Methodists.
Evangelical Lutherans.
Exactly. Yeah, they're like evangelical. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just they broke off a long time ago, and they are only Methodist in name.
They're not part of the United part.
No, they're just, yeah. It's like, within, everybody assumes that every Baptist is Southern Baptist, but that's just not true.
Let me guess, UCC don't have this problem.
What?
UCC does not have this
No, in
problem.
fact, we'll touch on that briefly.
They don't.
Okay. I want to totally ignore the United Church of Christ. Even though, as far as I know, we do not have any current members that are UCC members.
Over time, there's been one or two.
But over time, there have been a few. This is an interesting church in that it's the newest of the mainline denominations, but its roots go all the way back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans here in America. There are basically two main lines in their history. One's the Anglican or Anglo-Saxon line, and the other's the Germanic line that came together in 1957 to form the United Church of Christ. The groups that came over on the Mayflower and subsequent ships, shuffled around and mixed and matched, and it was generally congregational or Presbyterian in their structure. Then in the early 19th century, they kind of shifted around. During this Great Awakening period, there was some major restructuring that went on, and that was when we had the start of the Disciples Church, for example. And these churches continued to kind of move around as like independent little bubbles. And they finally decided, well, let's get better organized so we can do things better if we're together. And so they formed the Congregational Christian Church in the early 30s. Okay. Now, in the Germanic time, they also go back to the colonial period. There was a large group of Germans, and after the war, much like it was with the Methodists, they were separated from their brethren in Europe, so they decided to form the German Reformed Church. Then later in the mid-1800s, there was another major influx of Germans that came over, principally in the Mississippi Valley areas, where these were more in the northeast. But then this group came over, and they had a very much pietist type background, and they decided that there was a number of them around here in the U.S. They ought to get organized too, and they call themselves the Evangelical Synod of North America. These two German groups decided to get together about the same time, as this Anglican group got together. And then in 57, they formed the United Church of Christ. Okay, there's a few words on here I want to, got a few minutes, I don't have enough time, I think, to want to look at. We talked about this already, congregational, and we mentioned Episcopal format. Well, congregation means that you may be part of a larger group, like this Congregational Christian Church, and they will have general policies and statements they put out. But they're sort of like stop signs or stoplights in Rome. You know, they're there, but everybody's going to do what they want. And so, a congregation means that the power resides with the congregation.
Kind of like us.
Pardon?
Kind of like us.
Ah, yes. Come back next, in the next 2 weeks. So at any rate, you can tell by the name here, at any rate, this is going to have a congregational type structure where it has the authority to call ministers and do ordinations. Second interesting word to look at is reformed. We see this a lot. You hear a lot. What's it mean? What's it reformed with respect to?
Respect to the Catholic Church.
That's what we all think. But
That's not right.
That's not right.
That's Reformation. That's Reformation. Reformed is.
Yeah, but
Is this from a Lutheran perspective?
No. This, yes. Well, I think you're. Yeah, that's it. This is what the Calvinist group calls itself, the Reformed Church. Evolved down to the Presbyterians. They were reformed with respect to the Lutherans. They weren't Lutherans. They were trying to self-identify with respect to Luther's group versus their group. And of course, they both were splitting off from the Roman Catholics. Now here's the most interesting one. Evangelical. Luther, I think, is the one we can trace this back to pretty well. Evangelical just mean of the gospel, from the Greek word of the gospel. He thought that was an appropriate name, for the group that when he was kicked out or excommunicated by the Catholics, that he liked the term evangelical for the churches that followed him. The churches in general like to call themselves Lutherans. He didn't like that, and he tried to fight against it, but he lost. And of course, he died eventually, and they just continued to call themselves evangelicals. But then it kind of morphed into evangelical meaning either the Reformed group or the Lutheran group, the Calvinist group or Luther's group, and they were kind of collectively called evangelicals for maybe about a century or so. By the time the mid 1800s, it had changed again in how it was viewed, and it was really more focused on the pietists, the spiritualists, those that were part of the radical Reformation initially, and that's what the group that came over here in America in the mid 1800s were. Today, of course, and since the mid 20th century on, evangelical means something totally different. It generally means that conservative Christians, very Bible focused, also focused on individual, instantaneous, commonly salvation or being born again, and very strong missionary motivation. That's kind of what we think about when we see evangelical. So when you see it, the term, you need to look at it in context, pardon me, both in terms of time and also in terms of location. Okay, getting back to the UCC. They're very ecumenical. They've had open communion. They've been in full communion, quote-unquote full communion, with the disciples since, I think, 85, and which means that they not only share the communion table, but also that they share ministers between the groups. And subsequent to that, they now have similar kind of relationships with the Presbyterians and with the Lutherans as well. Most significantly, they're probably identified as being liberal and self-identified, and they're very proud of it. They've been very active in the civil rights movement, in women's movement, and there are a number of things that they were first among all the mainline churches. They were the first to endorse same-sex marriage in the late 60s. In 71, they came out with a strong endorsement of pro-choice in terms of abortion, and this is 2 years before Roe versus Wade. And they did the first openly gay ordination in 72. So, if you look at the Methodists kind of holding the line on this conservative position within the four groups that helped form this church, you have to put a UCC at the other end of the spectrum. And of course, now, as we talked about earlier, the Methodists are dividing on that. We're going to, over the next 2 weeks, be looking at this general issue of, more broadly though, in terms of conservatives versus liberals and the debates within the Protestant churches over the years. And so if you're interested in seeing kind of more of the history of that, we'll come prepared with questions and ideas and things, and we'll talk about it. Yeah.
Can I say something about the UCC? Can I say something about the UCC?
Yes, I was going to say, I'm pretty well buy-in, so.
This is something you wouldn't know about the UCC unless you're UCC. They are considered the most progressive of our four denominations, but within the UCC, they accept they'll take a very conservative church that believes that it's in the Bible's inerrant, that only men and women should be married, that only men have the right to preach and lead, and that is acceptable within their denomination. If that church chooses to stay with the United Church of Christ, then they're welcome to stay. And you don't meet many of them, but they're out there. And on the flip side, if they're super progressive, they're not asked to leave. They are welcomed. And I really appreciate that with the UCC, that there is fluidity amongst the fights that they're willing to fight. And what's really important is, and Larry's pointing to it, it's this idea of congregation. We might not agree, but we're in this together. And I like to think about UCC as being more like a franchise, and that, you're part.
Into it?
What's that?
You can buy into
Well,
it.
you can buy into it, but it's your
choice.
franchise. You can, you've been to McDonald's all over the country. They don't all look the same, and you go to McDonald's in California, they might sell a menu item that they don't sell in Georgia because they can. I don't know if y'all ever been to McDonald's in Japan. They sell the mixed salmon, which I think is very weird. Whatever. But there's room for that, and I really appreciate that in the UCC. They treat everyone in their denomination as family. And what I mean by that is you don't always agree with what your brother or sister's doing, but you're always going to love them. And I really appreciate that. It's a beautiful approach.
And I'm sort of begging the question a bit, or holding out the bait a little bit for the next couple of sessions we're going to do. But one thing to keep in mind is counterbalance to that is that when UCC formed in 1957, I can't remember the exact number of people, but say it was 10 million, whatever it was.
Sizable.
Sizable. Today, they're half that number.
Oh.
So, which kind of raises the question, is that the best approach if we're trying to grow the church? And so again, I'm not taking one side versus the other. I'm just saying that there are pros and cons with regard to each of these different types of organizational structures.
Haven't all churches decreased since 57 though?
Not all, no.
Almost all.
And I'll give you some specifics on that next week.
I'd like to pick up on Andy's using an analogy. If you look at these churches and the Methodists, they're splitting over ideals and different things, and you go back, if you're going to buy a car, okay? I bought a Volkswagen Beetle every year, but I really need to pull my trailer. Okay, I need a Ford pickup truck. But by golly, I'm loyal to my Volkswagen. And I'm trying to pull the trailer, okay? It's not working. Okay? Right?
Get a Silverado.
But so in terms of cars, you go find the match. You go find the match. And why some of the people, instead of fighting within a denomination, some of the people that are in the Methodists and saying this is where we should be, why don't they become UCC or Presbyterian or something and find a relationship with God that they're happy with versus fighting with a bunch of people. You know, go find the vehicle that works for you, for crying out loud.
That's Andy's point. That may be the direction they're headed.
Well, and that's unfortunately where a lot of these non-denominational churches come from. They say we don't want the hierarchy of the bigger church. We want to believe.
Yeah, I lived in Farmington and went to a Baptist church that changed their name. They took their sign down and put down Community Church, Pinion Community Church, Pinion Hills. Next thing you knew, they had to add on to the building. And then they had to go buy property and start building out in the edge of town because they were the same preachers. Okay? They just took down a sign that made people turn away. And so we're all caught in this at some level with the names.
You can see why people
Good and bad, okay?
are disgusted with organized religion when you sit here and talk about all this infighting. It doesn't mean they're not Christian. I see people that don't ever go to church because of that reason, that are out doing what Jesus would tell them to do.
I'm going to take the flip side, just to play devil's advocate. But on the other hand, there is things such as efficiency of scale. And that if you wanted to develop a missionary society or a Bible society or whatever, and you want to make major investments in order to promulgate the word, in particular other countries and so forth, you can't do that as a small individual congregation, but you can as you collect together. But when you collect together, then as soon as you collect together, it's as precious as you're pulling your apart.
Over what my opinion is trivial. You know?
So I'm going to ask this question of Andy, but it's really of our congregation. So we've talked about the 4 congregations now, and I see the influence of 3, but I don't see any influence of UCC. And I don't believe what you described of them is the way our church believes necessarily. So my question is, why are they still one of the 4 other than they provided us money back in our infancy?
Well, but that's key. The 4 we talk about is historical. You know, that's past history.
But I assume we still pay apportionments to each church and have a relationship with them. Is that correct?
Yeah. By the bylaws.
By the bylaws.
I have an answer to that.
Go ahead.
We don't pay apportionments in this church, we make contributions. For example, Presbyterians are very good about keeping their rolls up to date because Presbyterians pay an apportionment per member. And a couple of years ago, after 2 or 3, Bill's laughing, and after 2 or 3 communications about pay your apportionment, said, we will pay our apportionment and you're going to get a couple of $1,000s less. So would you like your apportionment or would you like your contribution? So we don't pay apportionments here. And what Larry said about it being historical, yes, the UCC was invited in, and they also gave us grants to get this started. So to get this church started. So they have a real historical basis here. But what we give them every year, gosh, I think it's less than $1,000 a year, maybe $1,500. I'd have to ask Shelley for that for sure, but it's a very small amount.
Okay. But if our church doesn't necessarily believe in the liberal approach or the liberal leaning of UCC, do we still, as a congregation, should we still have a relationship with them, despite what we're paying?
That's for the congregation to decide, but that would be a bylaw change. Now, when we get ready to call a minister, let's see who's listening here. You know, when we get ready to call a minister, we don't have to. We're not required to take applicants from the UCC.
or reply to them if they give you one.
But as I also said, within the UCC, you can have somebody that's uber conservative.
Yeah.
So,
I'll go back. Go back to looking for Andy. The head of the UCC was Bill Lyons. Bill Lyons rolled up his sleeves and spent a lot of time with us in terms of the pastor search committee's direction. What can I do to help? He wasn't stuffing a philosophy on us, but he was saying, what can I do to help? I have resources. What can I do
He's a great guy.
to help? He's a nice guy. And so when you look at him that way and you look at the four, and I had this problem when I first got here, is they get in the way. You get ready to do yearly reports, if you're not careful, you have to send in 4 yearly reports, because each one of them wants some information. But at the same time, they're a resource for us. And
Well, my parents taught me when I was growing up, you are what your friends are. Select your friends. This is the same thing in my mind.
well, my comment to you was just was hopefully a comment of comfort. That just because they are part of us, we still have our own autonomy, okay? And I do want to remind you what Andy said about the vast array within.
Well, one thing to attract to us.
About the World Council of Churches, because the New Mexico Council of Churches, that is the 5th entity that we support, even though they're not a denomination, but they are a consortium of churches across New Mexico. And they were very, I can't remember the guy's name right now, Walt somebody. They were very, very helpful in the formation of this church in terms of helping develop
And being
that
ecumenical.
Denominational capacity. I cleaned out my office over the last week. Oh my gosh, it was the scariest thing I've done in forever. But in that, I found Tracy's original notes. And this church started on faith by a couple of people with a real vision, and they started looking for a pastor when they had $1,500 some odd dollars in the bank, and that was it. So that's a real faith story. But because I just wanted to mention them because as we make our yearly denominational giving, they are a part of that. There again, it's even lower. It's a very nominal amount, but if nothing else, it's kind of an acknowledgement and a thank you, and the idea of unity that we've stressed so much with the disciples, the Presbyterians, and I'm sure you talked about it with the Methodists.
Just a comment here. I think when we stand before God on the day of judgment, I don't think the church label is going to be there. But if it is, then God's got a real job in this thing.
Good point. Okay, two things. It said the next 2 weeks we're going to be looking more broadly now at the history of liberal versus conservative debates in the classes and sort of building on this. The second is we're going to have the luncheon down here, so when you leave, if you could, get some help moving some of the tables back in this area and putting the chairs around them. We appreciate it. So,
And I'm
see you
going to
next
put
week.
these in the case.
I'll take that.
I don't think